So if you take a look at Daniel 8, I'm just going to go ahead and read through 8 just to get us caught back up to where we are. And I know for sure that we covered at least half of this handout. I don't remember. I made a note and then I lost my original handout, so I have another one. But I believe that we looked up to the point of the introduction of the goat, which is the Empire of Greece. I don't know that we finished all of that, so we'll slow down and take a look at that before we get into the identity of the four horns after the goat. But let's read Daniel 8. So I'll read if you just follow along with me, beginning in chapter 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west, over the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from its power, or his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" He said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, "Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision." So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end." Now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, "Behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. The ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the Prince of Princes, but he will be broken without human agency. The vision of the evenings and mornings, which has been told, is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. So if you look at your handout, let me just do a very brief review so we can get caught up. As we know, it's been about a month since we've been together in Daniel 8, so let's just do a quick review here. In Daniel 8, you can look at the simple outline this way: the giving of the vision in verses 1 through 14, the interpretation of the vision in 15 through 26, and then the secrecy of the vision in verse 27. When we look at this timing of the vision, when did Daniel see this? It was the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, approximately 551 BC, and so 3 years after the vision of chapter 7. So if you go back and recall what we saw in 7, this is 3 years later, but before the events of chapter 5. So just a reminder, as we're going through Daniel 1 through 5, 1 through 6, you see more of that chronological order. Once you hit 7 through 12, there are these flashbacks. Daniel is talking about visions that he saw in a previous time or at a previous time. And so this vision would fit right there somewhere in between chapters 4 and 5 of the book of Daniel. We know before chapter 5 because in chapter 5, that's when Babylon falls. That's when Belshazzar falls. This happens during the third year of Belshazzar. He's still in power. Babylon has not fallen yet. And so in his vision, he sees the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. And so he's seen this place that is set up that Darius will establish in the future, the administrative capital of the Persian Empire. And he sees the walls around the city, and because of the walls, the strength of that city, it is known as a citadel. And so what he's looking at in this province of Elam is about 200 miles east of Babylon and about 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf. And so that's the area that he's looking at there. He says he sees himself there. And so we don't quite know if he was transported there or in the vision he sees himself standing there. Some other passages that we looked at that are similar to what Daniel's experiencing were Ezekiel 8:3, 10:1, and Ezekiel 40, verse 2. So either way, Daniel sees this future location, this future event. He sees himself while he sees this vision. And in this vision, he sees two animals. He sees the ram, which we clearly know is the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel has a little confusion at first, but the angel tells him the ram represents Medo-Persia. And then there is a second animal that comes in, and it is the shaggy goat. And that goat represents Greece. And so as Daniel has seen these events, this revelation is given to him. This is giving the near and distant future to Daniel. There are many critics who would look at Daniel and say this was written after the fact. There's just too much detail for Daniel to have. This must have been written after all of these events have taken place. But we understand that God is the one who reveals mysteries, and God is omniscient. He knows everything beginning to end. And so as we believe those facts about God, we believe those to be factual, to be true, then there is no problem with Daniel receiving these decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years before they actually happen, and that they have great detail because God knows all the details. And so we understand that there is no reason for us to think that this was written at any time other than when Daniel says it was written, and that was during the third year of the reign of Belshazzar. And so you have the ram, the Medo-Persian Empire, in verses 3 and 4 as they are introduced there, or it is introduced, and then the goat in verses 4 through 8. And then there is a little horn that is mentioned in verses 9 through 14. Now, each one of these animals or the horn are given more detail in the later portion of the chapter. And so as you look at this, you see the rise and fall of the Medo-Persian Empire, and that animal it says butting west and north and south. And so it's out there on its conquest of the world in those areas. No animals could stand against the ram. And no one could be rescued from its power. It was just out there wild and without restraint. And so we saw this from history, we saw this from the Bible, that the Medo-Persian Empire came in and just dominated everything, Babylon included. And you see that transition of power from chapter 5 to chapter 6, where the Babylonian Empire falls, and then you have the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire with rulers like Cyrus and Darius. And then the goat comes in, and the goat is the Greek Empire, and that is led by Alexander the Great. And the goat comes in from the west, and it says he moves swiftly, so swiftly that he did not touch the ground, kind of leaving no footprints. That's how fast he's moving. And he attacks the ram with great rage. This is all under the, what are we at here? Point C, under the details of the vision. And again, I'm just doing a very quick review. And so the goat comes in and attacks the ram, and the ram is unable to resist. And so the goat defeats the ram, and the goat exalts himself. And so we see that Alexander comes in with a great power and swiftness and takes over not just the Medo-Persian Empire, but that part of the world. And he really does establish himself as a king of a vast empire. And all of this is done, by the way, before he reaches the age of 32. He dies very young. And so he comes in his teens, as we'll see in just a little bit, with one of his first decisive victories. And in his 20s, he experiences another victory. And before he's in his 30s, he is a world leader. He is a king that is dominating that part of the world. So history tells us that as this goat came in, as was described in the book of Daniel, Alexander came in that fashion, very quickly, very powerful. No one could withstand him, and certainly not the ram, which represented the Medo-Persian Empire. So let's take a look here at the next section, the interpretation of the vision. I skipped over the little horn. We're going to come into greater detail there, but we'll look at that in just a little bit. And so you see Daniel has the desire to understand the vision. That's in verses 15 through 19. He sees these animals as he had seen in previous visions, whether it's a statue or whether it was an animal, and he needs to know the meaning. And so the Lord sends a messenger to him, and that messenger is Gabriel. And so the angel Gabriel gives him the understanding that the ram and the goat are the Medo-Persian Empire in Greece, and that there is a little horn that is going to come up. As we'll see in a little bit, many scholars believe that that little horn represents two individuals. There is one that is a near fulfillment that rises from the remnant of the Greek Empire, and there is a distant fulfillment. And so one, many would say that would be, or was the leader, Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Or Antiochus IV, known as Epiphanes. And that future fulfillment, the greater horn to come, would be the Antichrist in the end times. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so Daniel is receiving this information from Gabriel. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. They come in, and then Greece comes in. And after Alexander is defeated, then you are going to see this little horn come up. And this little horn is going to do some wickedly amazing things. I don't know if you want to put those together, but I mean, what he does really amazes the world around him, but not in a good way. They are appalled. Many are appalled by what he does. Especially the Jewish people. And he has a great arrogance about him, blasphemous things that he says and does. And that is all representative of both Antiochus IV and the Antichrist to come. And so Daniel receives that information. When you look at, I know we covered the identity of the ram, looking at verses 8 through 20. And I believe we ended maybe with this quote from Walvoord, so let me just read that. There were two horns that came up when the ram presented itself. It says the lower horn apparently refers to the kingdom of the Medes, and the higher horn that came up later to the kingdom of Persia, which dominated Media. The fourth verse describes their conquest westward, northward, and southward, which characterized the history of this empire, as there was no considerable progress eastward. All of this prediction is precisely fulfilled in later history. Only by divine revelation could Daniel know in advance that the conquest of the Medes and Persians would be to the north, south, and west, but not to the east, in contrast to the Macedonian conquest, which were mainly to the east, as indicated in the subsequent verses in the activities of the he-goat. And so again, just the detail that is presented in this revelation that we have in the text, you can only attribute that kind of detail so far in advance to God himself. Daniel receives it, but none of these visions, none of these dreams come from Daniel's own mind or his ability. This all comes from the Lord giving it to Daniel, and then Daniel is instructed either to give that information quickly or to seal it up, as we see at the end of this chapter. Don't reveal this. This pertains to many days from now. When we look at the identity of the goat, here is more information. We'll slow down a little bit and take a look at Greece and Alexander. And it is very interesting. I gave you quite a bit of information here, but I really had to kind of synthesize all of this as I was going through and reading several chapters in books and many articles about Alexander, some biblical and some secular. And just seeing the continuity between them is amazing. Because you see where the Bible is talking about the conquest of this goat, and world history will tell us the same things, maybe in different words, but it's saying the same thing about Alexander and this empire. And so like the ram, the goat also represents a king and kingdom. But unlike the ram, the goat has only one horn initially. So remember, the ram came up, 2 horns, the Medo-Persian Empire. Here, though, the goat comes in, and there's the one conspicuous horn. And that is Alexander the Great. He is the king of the Macedonian Empire, the king of Greece, and he was born in 356 BC. We know to King Philip II and to Queen Olympias. Of course, we know, I think most of us understand, that the Greeks believed in their mythology, and many people said that in their Greek legends that Zeus was actually the father of Alexander, because Alexander was such a brilliant and skilled and ruthless warrior. And just to give you a little advance on the notes here, he was never defeated in battle. And so he did not know defeat. He only had the taste of victory. And so many saw him as like a son of the gods, a son of Zeus. At 16, while his father was engaged in battle at Byzantium, Alexander defeated the sacred band of Thebes. Now, this group was supposed to be an undefeatable group. And so, of course, word spreads. Alexander did the impossible. Alexander defeated the sacred band of Thebes, and that was at the Battle of Chaeronea. In 336 BC, when he was 20 years old, Alexander became king after his father was assassinated by his bodyguard. And so now that his father is out, Alexander takes the throne, and he already has a victory under his belt. And he becomes the king of that Macedonian empire. There are a number of battles that take place. You see a reference here to the Battle of Issus, 333 BC. Alexander defeats the Persian king Darius III. Now, Darius was not killed, but his forces were defeated. And history tells us that realizing the battle was lost, Darius abandoned his family and fled for his life. And so he just got out of Dodge. He took off. He knew that everything was lost. And so he left to see another day. And so he flees in defeat. In 331 BC, you see the battle of, I believe that's Gaugamela. Alexander, he began his war against the Persians in 334, so a few years before, at age 22. And by age 33, some say 32, some say 33 when he died. And so by that point, in his early 30s, he ruled the largest empire of the ancient world. Okay? That victory at Gaugamela on the Persian plain, that was a decisive victory, a decisive conquest that ensured that he defeated the Persians. And again, Darius lived through that battle. He fled, but he didn't live for very long. Alexander then won that series of battles, and if you look at point H here, Alexander ultimately became the ruler of the defeated Persian Empire. And this is a quote that is said of Alexander and his forces. Of Alexander's men, about 100 were killed, and more than 1,000 of his horses, either from wounds or exhausted in the pursuit. Of the barbarians, there are said to have been 300,000 slain, and far more taken prisoners than were killed. And that's from an article, Alexander Defeats the Persians in 331 BC. And so history tells us that he went in with great ferocity, and although he suffered some losses, which you always suffer losses in battle, his losses were very small, minor, compared to what he did to the opposing armies. And so he came in with that swiftness and fierceness, just as Daniel saw in his vision. And after this fierce battle, it's believed that Darius fled and was assassinated by his own troops. They had lost all hope, and there was no support for him. They realized that he had fled and saw him as cowardly as he's fleeing, and they ended up rising up against Darius, and they killed him. At least that's what a lot of history records tells us, that Darius was assassinated by his own troops. And so we see the rise of the Greek Empire, very quick under Alexander, very fierce army and leader, but it didn't last very long. Alexander died at a very early age, whether it's 32 or 33 years old. He died in his early 30s, really when he had reached the peak of power. Again, he had this vast empire, and he had never tasted defeat up to that point. And so let's go back to verse 8 of chapter 8, and then we'll kind of bring it back and forth here. Verse 8, this is talking about the male goat, which we know is Alexander. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so right as Alexander was at the peak of power, he's removed from power. He dies. It is interesting that when you look at the empire, which, by the way, it was the entire Persian Empire, that was Asia Minor, Persia, Egypt, and everything in between, including Israel. And so a very large empire. Again, he was never defeated in battle, and how he died, we're not quite certain. Some say that he died from malaria. Others say that it was natural causes, which at 32 or 33, I don't know. I mean, that's possibly, but some say he was poisoned. Nobody knows for sure how he died, but he did die in his early 30s, again, not in battle, but of some mysterious cause. Natural causes, malaria, poisoning, who knows? We don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us how he died, and history can't tell us how he died, but we know he died at a very early age. Well, when he died, Alexander did not leave any successor to the throne. There are all sorts of speculations and ideas about Alexander. We know that he was married to at least 3 women. One of them, probably the most famous, would be Roxana, and he did have a child with her, but that child was not born until after his death. And she actually, in a later time, was actually killed by one of the generals that was under Alexander's lead, she and her son. Many say that Alexander was homosexual or bisexual. We don't know for sure. I mean, they talk about one of his male lovers. I mean, he was a very bloodthirsty, perverted person. And he did not leave an heir to the throne. And so there was no one there. So what happened is the kingdom was divided into 4 portions. And so this vast Macedonian empire is broken up. In fact, take a look at Daniel 11:4. Now, Daniel 11, which we'll get to in the weeks to come, has far more detail than we see in Daniel 8. And I don't want to focus too much attention on Daniel 11. We'll get there when we get there, and when we do, we're probably going to spend at least 3, maybe 4 weeks there, depending on how much detail we get into. 45 verses of great detail. And when you see how precise it is, I mean, it really is kind of mind-blowing that the Lord knows all these details in advance. But again, that's a testimony of his omniscience. Well, Daniel 11:4 speaks of this mighty king. We'll actually start in verse 1, and then we'll see verse 4 gives us more information about Alexander's death and who took over in his place. 11:1 says, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will rouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases." So Daniel says there's a series of Persian empires or kings that are going to come up, But there is going to be another one, this king of Greece, who's going to do whatever he wants. And that's another reference to Alexander, that shaggy goat from Daniel 8. But as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, so north, south, east, and west, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. And so as we see here, Daniel was told that this future king, Alexander the Great, he is going to die. His vast empire is going to be given to someone else. It won't be anyone in his family that takes over. Now, when you take a look at history, we understand, and this is on the next page under point 3, that 4 of his generals are appointed leaders over 4 different sections of this Macedonian empire. Ptolemy was over Egypt, South Syria, and Palestine. Cassander over Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus over Thrace and Asia Minor. And then Seleucus, North Syria, eastern regions, and Mesopotamia. And so that's the way this vast empire is parceled out. 4 generals take these regions, and they are leading, in a sense, as the kings of these areas. And so Alexander died mysteriously, left no heir to the throne, and just as the Bible says, the land was given, the empire was given, divided into 4 areas, into 4 regions, and these 4 generals took over as the leaders of this great Greek empire. Now, they reigned for some time, but if you look at verse 23, back to Daniel chapter 8, there was another horn that would come up. And this horn now gets us to this identity of Antiochus IV and the Antichrist. And we start to see information, some detail about an event that is known as the Abomination of Desolation. We'll read more about that in the future chapters in Daniel, but we'll introduce that a little bit here with the remainder of our time in chapter 8. And so during the reign of these 4 generals over these 4 different regions, another horn rises up. And so if you look at verse 23, in the latter period of their rule, that means of those who took over Alexander's empire, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. By his power he will be mighty, or his power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree. And so as we see here, this little horn rises up. And so you have these 4 leaders, this little one comes in, and he will, as you see in verse 24, he destroys to an extraordinary degree. He prospers and performs his will, destroys mighty men and the holy people. He's rising up against the Jewish people. Through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart. So again, that pride is welling up within him. And he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. And so there's a very brief summary of the rise of this leader. He comes in quickly. He is very bloodthirsty, very skilled. He has great power. He uses his power to destroy others. And he even puts himself against God himself as he opposes the Prince of Princes. And interesting, when you look at the end of verse 25, he is broken without human agency. And so there is no one who really comes to defeat him. And we'll talk about his demise in just a little bit. Well, when you look at the history that we have been following so far, the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire and the fall of Babylon, then the rise of Greece, Alexander's success, and then Alexander's death and leaving no heir to the throne. And then you have the 4 generals who come in and they parcel out the empire. And then you have this 4th horn that comes out, or this leader, this king, and this little horn that comes up, Antiochus IV. When you look at history, history books will tell you that he rose from the Syrian kingdom. He was a Seleucid king. And he was known as Antiochus IV. He took upon himself the name Epiphanes, Okay? This kind of shows you the arrogance that he had. Epiphanes means an illustrious one, or God manifest. And so he saw himself as God. And he wanted that kind of honor. He wanted that kind of worship. He reigned from 175 to 164 BC. Now, this is the same individual that we see in Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 through 35. And we've already heard about this individual in Daniel 7, verse 8, and then verses 24 through 26. Let's go back to chapter 7 just to give us a little bit of a reminder of his character, the kind of person this is. And we might jump to Daniel 11, but not, again, go into great detail. Daniel 7, looking at verse 8, says, "While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by it, and behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast." And so he comes in, he deposes kings and other leaders, and he is speaking great boast of himself. And so that falls right in line with what we saw in Daniel chapter 8. If you look at verses 24, 25, and 26, it says, "As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever." And so as we read in Daniel, whether it's Daniel 7, Daniel 8, or Daniel 11, these references to this little horn, to this future king, they go between describing Antiochus IV or the Antichrist in the end. And so what you really have here is a near fulfillment with Antiochus and then a future fulfillment with the Antichrist to come. Take a look at Daniel 11. We'll look at verses 21 through 35, and not to go in, again, any explanation, but just to read through it and then come back to Daniel 8. Daniel 11, beginning in verse 21. "In his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large army and a mighty army for war. But he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil. They will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. When you look at this man, he rises and he engages in battle. He seems to be making these pacts with other leaders. He is a very, very dangerous and wicked and godless individual. Again, more information as we get to chapter 11, but let me give you a little summary of what this man, Antiochus IV, did. So go back to your notes here. As we said, he reigned from 175 to 164 BC, and he took upon himself the title of Epiphanes, the illustrious one, or God manifest. But the Jews called him Epimanes, which means the mad one. I mean, they saw him and said, this guy is insane. He is bloodthirsty. And so he calls himself Epiphanes, but we call him Epimanes, which means, again, the mad one. In 167, he enforced Hellenization on Jerusalem. And so that was to kind of not just integrate them, but make them more Greek than Jewish. And they would do this with the people that they conquer. They introduced the Greek language and the arts and the cultures and everything to try to get them to become more and more like the Greeks. In fact, when you look at the New Testament and you wonder why it was written in Greek when the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, part of that is the Hellenization of that area. And so they were speaking, and we find the scriptures in Koine Greek in the New Testament. It goes back to the reign of Alexander, the Macedonian Empire, the enforcing of Hellenization by Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, Antiochus raided the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted to completely do away with worshiping Yahweh, and so he made it illegal. He forbade the worship of Yahweh God. And as he raided the temple in Jerusalem and plundered its treasures, he set up an altar to Zeus and would sacrifice swine, pigs on the altar. This is part of what they're talking about with the abomination of desolation. So he goes in there and he does all of these unclean things to false gods within the temple of Jerusalem. And so the Jews obviously were outraged. They were not happy at all with what was happening, this profaning of the temple. And his response of Antiochus IV, his response was to kill many Jews. He rose up and many Jews were slain and some were sold into slavery. And so he really is persecuting the Jewish people in addition to desecrating their temple. So he also declared that to practice circumcision was punishable by death. That may not seem like a big thing to us, but for Jewish people, that was a sign of the covenant. If you don't circumcise your male child on the 8th day, you are violating what God commanded to be done all the way back to the days of Abraham. And he says, if you follow this practice, if you want to be Jewish and you follow this practice, it's punishable by death. Not only that, but history tells us that the Jews were ordered to sacrifice to pagan gods and to even eat the flesh of pigs. And so they really were persecuted under Antiochus Epiphanes. Now this abomination of desolation, if you go back to Daniel 8, in, Daniel 8, verse 14. Actually, go back to verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? It says, how long is this abomination going to take place? And as we look in the future, how long is Antiochus going to bring this kind of attack against the Jewish people and God himself in his temple? Well, the answer is 2,300 evenings and mornings, for the holy place will be restored properly, or properly restored. Well, when you look at history, it tells us here that his persecution began on September 6, 171, and ended on December 25th, 165, 164, depending on your dating by some there. And so when you look at that, it comes out to that 2,300 days. So he was there for quite some time, just desolating the temple and bringing persecution to the Jewish people. And that, by the way, is where we get the origin of Hanukkah. Okay? And we'll come back to point M in a bit. But if you look at N, after his death, Jews celebrated the cleansing of their holy place in the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah, in celebration of the restoration led by Judas Maccabeus, which was known as the Maccabean Revolt. And so you had Jews who saw what was happening under Antiochus, and they simply would not tolerate it. They gathered together, their armies, their forces joined together, and they would rise up in like guerrilla warfare against Antiochus. And he was really blindsided by that. He was never able to take control after the Maccabeans rose. And that was known as the Maccabean Revolt. Just, again, a very short summary of that event. But as they became victorious, they celebrated after Antiochus' death. And that is what we see today as Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights. History tells us that he died of some illness. Now, some say that it was some kind of bowel disease. Some say it was some other mysterious illness. But again, if you go back to chapter 8, verse 25, he will be broken without human agency. Okay? He's going to die, but he's not going to be defeated. He's not going to be killed by some foreign army. He's not going to be assassinated by one of his advisors or one of his bodyguards. He's broken without human agency. And we see from history that there was some illness that took him out. Whether you say it was a mysterious illness or was some kind of intestinal bowel disease, either way Antiochus dies. And it wasn't at any hand of a human. Some illness struck him and he died. And it was after his death then that the Jews celebrated that he had died, and that was the establishing of Hanukkah. So now that is just the near fulfillment. If you hold to this view, and I think that this is probably the most accurate to the text in history, looking at the interpretation of Daniel, looking at this little horn, or this king that arises. Antiochus was very much an antichrist. And we understand from Scripture that many antichrists have arisen. There are many antichrists there in the time of the first century when that was written. In 1 John, there are many antichrists today. Antiochus certainly was an antichrist. But was he the antichrist? And I believe the Bible tells us the answer is no. There are still things to be fulfilled in the future, still these greater desolations, greater abominations to come, and a greater antichrist, that singular individual, that the focus is on him rising in the future. And Daniel gets more information about that. We'll see more about that in chapter 11, but for the sake of time today as we close, who was this little horn? Well, the near fulfillment was Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. The future fulfillment would be, or will be, the Antichrist that we read about in Daniel, in Thessalonians, the man of lawlessness who comes, looking at Revelation. And so we see there's still a future Antichrist to come, but there was a near fulfillment during that last portion of the years before the birth of Christ, about 150, 175 years before the birth of Christ. Next week. Father, we come before you. We thank you so much for this morning and for this opportunity to go through chapter 8. And I pray that as we have kind of taken a jet tour there from history and the future, that we will have that understanding that you know what is going to happen, that you know all the details beginning to end, and that what you have revealed in your word is accurate and it is true, and that we are to believe it and have assurance in it and have our hope in it, knowing that even though there are going to be some very godless individuals who rise in the future, and there's going to be great attacks against you and your people, that we know that in the end you protect the souls of your people and you will be victorious. And that is the hope that you are giving to us, the hope that you gave to Daniel, that you will never be dethroned, no matter who sits on the earthly throne. We pray that we will just be encouraged to proclaim Christ and proclaim the victory that he had on the cross and from his resurrection from the dead, and that victory he will have at his second coming as he is seated on the throne of his father David. We thank you for telling us the end of the story, and we know that it is a victorious one for you and your Son and your kingdom, as he will be seated as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We thank you and we praise you in Christ's name. Amen.